The Pacific sky once belonged to Japan. In the early years of World War II, their Zero fighters ruled the air with a grace and lethality the world had never seen. Pilots believed they were untouchable, faster, more agile, and guided by an unbreakable code of honor. For a time, that belief was true. From the Philippines to the Coral Sea, Japanese aviators cut through Allied squadrons like ghosts. The Zero could climb faster, turn tighter, and strike from impossible angles. American pilots who faced them spoke of the encounters with a mix of awe and dread. "They came out of the sun," one survivor said. "You saw the flash, and then you were falling." Everywhere the Zero appeared, it inspired fear. And in Tokyo, it inspired pride. Newspapers called it the sword of the empire, proof that Japan could match and surpass the West in technology and spirit. Young men dreamed of becoming pilots, of earning the white scarf and the rising sun painted on their wings. Training schools across Japan filled with recruits. Instructors told them that skill and devotion would always defeat machines. They were taught that courage could replace armor, and that precision could overcome numbers. "Speed, surprise, and sacrifice," said one flight manual. 3 words that defined the Empire's air doctrine, and for nearly 2 years, it worked. American and British aircraft seemed clumsy by comparison, heavy, underpowered, and short-ranged. Dogfights were decided in seconds. A Zero could twist inside its opponent's turn, fire a burst, and vanish before the enemy even realized what happened. But that supremacy came with a cost. Japan's aircraft were masterpieces of lightness, built for agility, not survival. No self-sealing fuel tanks, little armor around the cockpit. A single hit could turn them into fireballs. The pilots didn't mind. Many saw that fragility as proof of purity. They didn't expect to live long. They expected to die gloriously. The Americans, meanwhile, were learning. Every defeat became data. Every wrecked Zero was studied piece by piece. Engineers sketched, measured, and whispered the same question: how do we beat this? By 1943, that question had an answer. It began not in a factory, but in an idea, the belief that technology could turn the tide of war. The United States poured resources into one of the most ambitious aviation projects in history, a fighter that could fly farther, faster, and higher than anything Japan possessed. In California, prototypes took shape under bright hangar lights. The first models were sleek but flawed, fast at low altitude, weak at high. Then came the change that would alter the war, the decision to mount a Rolls-Royce Merlin engine, the same heart that powered Britain's Spitfires. Suddenly, the aircraft leapt beyond its limits. The P-51 Mustang was born. It was more than a plane. It was a statement. With a range of over 1,600 miles and a top speed above 430 miles per hour, it could chase the enemy wherever they fled. It carried 6 .50 caliber machine guns and could climb past 40,000 feet. The sky that once belonged to Japan was about to change hands. At first, Japanese intelligence dismissed the rumors. Their pilots had heard of new American planes before, and none had lived up to the talk. The Zero, they said, was still the master of the Pacific. But then the first encounters began, small at first, almost accidental. A formation of Zeros patrolling over the Philippines spotted a group of unfamiliar aircraft glinting in the morning light. The Japanese leader ordered an attack. The newcomers didn't run. They turned, climbed, and met them head-on. Within minutes, 2 Zeros were spiraling toward the sea. The survivors radioed a single shaken message: "These are not the planes we fought before." Word spread quickly through Japan's air bases. Pilots gathered around maps, tracing the reports with disbelief. The new American fighter could dive faster than the Zero, recover quicker, and, most shocking of all, follow them into climbs where no other plane had ever dared. For the first time, Japanese airmen looked at the sky and felt doubt. The P-51 didn't just match them, it surpassed them in the very qualities they prized most. It turned smoothly, accelerated like lightning, and refused to stall. Even its sound was alien, a deep, confident roar compared to the high-pitched buzz of the Zero's engine. The first time Lieutenant Hiroshi Tanaka saw one, he thought it was a mirage. "It came from above, silver against the sun," he later said. "I tried to turn. It was already behind me." Within seconds, his squadron was shredded. He limped home alone, his plane riddled with holes. When he landed, mechanics counted more than 300 bullet impacts. "What kind of machine fires like that?" he whispered. Back in the briefing rooms, Japanese commanders struggled to understand what they were facing. Some dismissed the reports as exaggeration. Others suspected the Americans had simply improved their older P-40s. But the truth was already clear to those who had seen the silver wings up close. The Zero. By 1944, the Pacific no longer felt like home for Japanese pilots. The clouds they once owned had become haunted with silver shadows, fast, quiet, and merciless. They called them the long-range ghosts. At first, the P-51 Mustangs were rare sightings, streaks of silver cutting across blue horizons. But soon they came in squadrons, glinting in the sunlight like blades. They seemed to appear from nowhere, high, silent, invisible until it was too late. When the first full formations of Mustangs began escorting American bombers over Japan's island defenses, disbelief turned into dread. The Zero had ruled by speed and agility, but the P-51 changed the rules. It wasn't just fast, it was relentless. The Japanese pilots couldn't understand how a single fighter could fly from Iwo Jima, protect bombers all the way to Tokyo, and still fight on equal terms. The range was impossible, almost supernatural. "We used to count the minutes before the enemy turned back," one Japanese officer wrote. "Now, they never turned back." It was the first sign that Japan's skies no longer belonged to Japan. The encounters that followed weren't just battles. They were chases, ambushes, collapses of confidence. In the words of Lieutenant Hiroshi Tanaka, "We began each mission already defeated." The Mustang's advantage wasn't only speed, it was altitude. Japanese pilots had trained for close combat, where skill and reflex ruled. But the Americans fought from the sky's upper layers, where the air was thin and the Zero struggled to climb. From there, the Mustangs dove like hawks, their 6 machine guns blazing in a thunder of metal and smoke. No warnings, no maneuvers, just sudden death from above. For pilots who had once believed that honor lived in the duel, it was unbearable. "We never even saw them until the tracers reached us," said one survivor. "We were no longer fighting enemies. We were being hunted." Even the sound of the Mustang became a symbol of fear. Its Merlin engine had a deep, rising growl that echoed across the sky long before the aircraft appeared. Japanese ground crews learned to recognize it instantly. When that sound rolled over the horizon, men would look up, squinting at the glare, knowing that somewhere above, invisible silver wings were circling. Those who survived a Mustang encounter often came back silent. They didn't brag or shout as before. They just stared into space, their hands trembling slightly as they held their helmets. The Imperial Navy began receiving more reports of pilots refusing combat, feigning engine trouble, or deliberately breaking formation. It was unthinkable months before. But now, fear had become a quiet epidemic. The P-51 was fast, but what broke Japan's spirit was its reach. No longer confined to local dogfights, the Americans could now strike deep into the heart of the empire. The Mustangs escorted massive waves of B-29 bombers across thousands of miles, cutting down any defenders who rose to meet them. Tokyo, Osaka, Nagoya, cities that had once seemed untouchable, were now within reach of fire. The Japanese Air Command tried to adapt. They modified the Zero, upgraded engines, added heavier armament. But each improvement came with a cost: slower turns, heavier frames, less agility. The machine that once danced through clouds now moved like a ghost weighed down by its own legend. And across the ocean, America kept building. Every factory, every assembly line, every engineer worked toward one purpose: complete control of the sky. The contrast was staggering. Japan's air industry was scattered, fragmented, and starved of fuel and materials. Replacement planes came slower each month, and new pilots were trained in weeks instead of years. Inexperienced, under-equipped, they climbed into cockpits with trembling hands. For them, facing a Mustang wasn't combat, it was suicide. One pilot, barely 19, wrote in his diary before a mission, "I will see the enemy today. They say he flies like the wind. If I fall, let it be quickly." He never returned. The few veterans left began to understand what was happening. They weren't just losing air superiority. They were witnessing the collapse of an entire philosophy of war. For years, Japan had built its strategy on courage, precision, and sacrifice. But the P-51 embodied something different, an industrial miracle powered by resources, innovation, and the belief that the machine could be as decisive as the man. The Japanese pilots flew for honor. The Americans flew for inevitability. That difference was devastating. From the decks of American carriers, new squadrons launched daily, organized, well-trained, and endlessly supplied. The Japanese, by contrast, patched up damaged aircraft with scrap metal, reused oil filters, and stretched every drop of fuel. When Mustang pilots radioed their bases, they heard music, laughter, confidence. When Japanese pilots called theirs, they heard static. By mid-1944, entire units had vanished from the skies. One squadron reported a 90% casualty rate within 2 weeks. Another, once considered elite, was wiped out in 3 missions. The survivors spoke of facing not men, but machines that never tired. The first time a group of Zeros encountered Mustangs near Iwo Jima, the Japanese commander tried to dive and escape, a maneuver that usually guaranteed safety. But this time, the Mustangs followed, engines screaming. They didn't break off. They didn't lose altitude. They followed all the way down, firing until the sea swallowed the wreckage. Witnesses said the survivors returned, pale and speechless. "They can do everything we can do," one muttered, "but faster." The shock was total. The once proud elite of Japan, Air Arm, now found themselves questioning every lesson they had ever learned. The belief that skill could overcome technology began to crumble. "We were told the heart decides victory," said one veteran, "but now the machine decides." In a culture built on discipline and pride, admitting that was unthinkable. Yet each mission made it harder to deny. Soon, American bombers began to strike Japan's mainland. The Mustangs were there too, soaring high above the firestorms, clearing the skies of defenders before the B-29s even arrived. To civilians below, the silver streaks became omens. To the pilots, they became nightmares. For the first time in the war, Japan's airmen began to avoid confrontation. They would rise, engage briefly, and retreat. The officers noticed the pattern, but said nothing. Everyone understood the truth. There was no longer anything left to win. Letters intercepted from Japanese pilots tell a story not of hatred, but of exhaustion. "We fight like ghosts now," one wrote. "The Americans never stop. Their machines never stop. Even the wind seems on their side." Back in the training schools, the tone changed. Instructors no longer promised glory. They spoke of duty, of sacrifice, of one-way missions. The Zero was no longer the sword of the Empire. It was its final offering. And high above the Pacific, the Mustangs kept flying, circling the last pockets of resistance. Their engines thundered over the islands where thousands of young men waited for orders they knew would lead to death. Japan's aces, those who had once laughed at the slow, clumsy American planes, were now gone, shot down, captured or lost in the sea. The new recruits flew in their place, barely trained, their fear hidden behind forced smiles. When asked how it felt to face the P-51, one of them simply said, "It feels like watching the future destroy the past." And he was right, because by then the P-51 wasn't just a weapon, it was a prophecy, a glimpse of what modern warfare had become. Not a test of courage, but of creation. Not a duel of men, but a contest of nations. The sky had turned silver, and in its reflection Japan saw the beginning of its end. By late 1944, the once mighty Japanese air fleet was no longer fighting for dominance. It was fighting for survival. The sound of the P-51 Mustang had become the soundtrack of defeat, echoing across the islands and airfields that once symbolized imperial pride. The young pilots arriving for training at bases in Kyushu and Formosa grew up hearing legends of the Zero. They had memorized stories of daring victories, of brave duels in the clouds. But by the time they entered the cockpit, those stories felt like ghosts from another war. The instructors tried to keep the illusion alive, talking about honor, sacrifice, and the Emperor's destiny. Yet every man in the hangar knew the truth. The Americans owned the sky. One pilot, writing in a secret journal, confessed, "We salute, we smile, we swear to die with pride, but we already know the Mustang will find us before we ever see it." The fear wasn't just tactical, it was spiritual. Japan's warriors had been raised to believe that courage could overcome any obstacle, that purity of intent made them unstoppable. But courage didn't outfly machine guns. Purity didn't climb faster than a Merlin engine. And every time a P-51 swept past at impossible speed, it chipped away at the foundation of their faith. Reports from intelligence units described a growing hesitation among Japanese squadrons. Missions delayed for mechanical issues, flights turning back early, entire groups breaking formation mid-battle. The officers blamed fatigue, but they knew it was something deeper. Each pilot who saw the silver Mustang up close returned changed, quiet, withdrawn, eyes hollow. The old bravado was gone. A few still believed in miracles. They spoke of perfect ambushes, of night strikes, of one great victory that might turn the tide. But even those men flew with a kind of fatal calm, like actors in a play whose ending they already knew. Meanwhile, the Americans kept evolving. Every month, new variants of the P-51 arrived. Better engines, refined aerodynamics, extended range. Pilots who had started the war as rookies were now veterans with hundreds of flight hours, their confidence growing with every mission. They weren't just fighting the Japanese, they were dismantling an empire piece by piece from the sky. One American ace described the sensation of flying over Tokyo's burning skyline. You could feel their spirit breaking. It wasn't the city that burned, it was their will to fight. In Japan, the High Command searched for answers. The generals still spoke in patriotic speeches, but even they began to realize that something invisible had shifted. The balance of power had moved beyond reach. Factories couldn't keep up. Fuel reserves were nearly gone. New aircraft barely left the assembly lines before being destroyed by bombing raids. Even the instructors were being sent to the front lines. The once proud Zero squadrons, symbols of Japan's mastery of the sky, were being replaced by hastily trained teenagers. The average life expectancy of a new pilot had fallen to under 2 weeks, and every mission carried the same shadow, the Mustang. In combat, Japanese pilots began to see a pattern that haunted them. The Mustangs didn't just fight, they hunted with coordination and intelligence. 2 would bait the enemy into a climb, while 2 others swooped down from altitude. The result was chaos, one-sided, brutal, and final. Witnesses described air battles lasting only seconds. One Zero pilot later recalled, "It was as if they could read our thoughts. Before I turned, they were already there." For many, survival became the only goal. But survival in such conditions carried its own burden. In a culture where dying in battle was sacred, returning alive began to feel like failure. The survivors faced shame from their peers and suspicion from officers. Some were even accused of cowardice. It was a cruel paradox. The only way to live was to run, but running was dishonor. So they began to rationalize a new form of courage. Death, not in victory, but in deliberate sacrifice. The whispers of special attack units began to spread. At first it sounded like rumor, desperate talk from desperate men, but as the Mustang and the B-29s closed in on the mainland, that whisper became official policy. If Japan couldn't match America's machines, it would weaponize its spirit instead. Thus, the idea of the kamikaze was born, not from fanaticism, but from despair. In late 1944, the first Toko pilots gathered at their bases. They were told their mission would save Japan, that their deaths would frighten the Americans more than any bomb. Many volunteered out of genuine belief, others quietly out of resignation. Behind their courage lay something unspoken, the understanding that the war in the sky was already lost. As they prepared for their final flights, they still heard the roar of the Mustangs above, circling endlessly, the symbol of the machine that had made their sacrifice necessary. In one letter recovered after the war, a young kamikaze pilot wrote to his sister, "I am not afraid of death. I am afraid that even my death will change nothing." That single line captured the tragedy of an entire generation. The P-51 Mustang had done more than shoot down planes. It had shattered Japan's belief in its own mythology. For decades, the Japanese military had built its power on the idea that discipline and faith could overcome material limits. That belief had carried them across Asia, through victories that defied logic. But the Mustang represented something new, something terrifying. A war driven by industry, by innovation, by mathematics and metal instead of spirit. The pilots felt it every time they looked up at the sky. They were witnessing the birth of a new age, one where the outcome of battle was decided long before the first shot was fired. Back home, civilians began to sense it too. Bombing raids grew more frequent. The air raid sirens became background noise. Children drew pictures of silver planes in their notebooks. The fear that once lived on the battlefield had reached every home. And in that fear, something profound began to change. The Japanese people started to question the cost of pride. The old promise that sacrifice would lead to victory was beginning to sound hollow. Still, the pilots flew, because even as their spirits broke, their duty remained. Every takeoff was an act of defiance against fate. Every mission, a prayer whispered into the wind. They knew the Mustangs were waiting, hidden somewhere above the clouds. They knew they would not return. But they flew anyway, because sometimes courage isn't about believing you'll win. It's about flying even when you know you won't. By 1945, the Pacific no longer echoed with the sounds of dogfights. The duels that once defined air superiority had vanished, replaced by one-sided hunts that left no doubt about who ruled the skies. The Zero, once the most feared plane in the world, now burned across the ocean like falling stars, and above it all, the silver wings of the Mustang stretched from horizon to horizon, symbols of a new kind of warfare. For the Americans, the sky had become a highway of victory. For the Japanese, it had become a graveyard. From bases on Saipan and Iwo Jima, thousands of P-51s took off daily, their engines roaring in unison. The airfield shook as pilots saluted ground crews, some smiling, some silent, all knowing that their mission wasn't just to fight, it was to erase resistance from the map. Each flight meant more than combat, it meant dominance, it meant control of time, distance, and destiny. The Mustang's range made every corner of the Pacific reachable. The same plane that had once been a symbol of protection for bombers now became the sword that struck deep into Japan itself. High above the clouds, the formations moved like clockwork. Squadrons of silver arrows slicing through the blue, escorting massive waves of B-29 bombers headed toward Tokyo, Osaka, and Nagoya. Below them, the earth glowed orange from fires that never seemed to end. The Japanese defenders tried to respond, but the pattern was always the same: chaotic takeoffs, desperate climbs, and sudden disappearance. Those who reached altitude found themselves outnumbered, outgunned, and outflown. Many didn't even see their killers. American pilots described seeing black dots far below, rising slowly toward them, struggling to climb. They'd make one pass, unleash a burst of machine gun fire, and the dots vanished in smoke. It wasn't a battle anymore. It was execution from the stratosphere. On the ground, civilians could see the Mustangs shining overhead, circling like hawks, while bombers turned cities into firestorms. To many Japanese citizens, the silver planes looked beautiful, terrible, but beautiful. Some children even called them the silver gods, but beauty can carry terror. Every time those engines roared, it meant another city was dying. In Tokyo, air raid shelters filled nightly. People prayed, whispered, and waited for the sound of the Mustangs to pass. They didn't always. The Americans had mastered something beyond technology. They had mastered endurance. Their pilots rotated in shifts, rested, refueled, and returned. Japan could no longer replace the men or the machines being lost. The war had become a storm that only blew one way. And still, the Mustang evolved. Engineers pushed its limits further, extended fuel tanks, advanced targeting systems, improved oxygen supplies for high-altitude flight. The plane that had once been a tactical fighter was now a long-range predator. Some Japanese pilots tried to adapt by flying at night or hiding among the clouds, but even then, radar-equipped Mustangs found them. Others tried hit-and-run ambushes waiting near bomber routes, but the Mustangs learned faster. Each failed counterattack taught the Americans how to make the next victory cleaner, faster, and more decisive. The balance had shifted from courage to calculation. Every mission was planned down to the minute, every angle of attack, every altitude, every fuel drop, mathematics guiding the war. For Japan, that was the most terrifying part. The Americans didn't seem angry anymore. They weren't fighting for revenge or pride. They were fighting like engineers, precise, methodical, unstoppable. It was no longer personal, it was industrial. And for a nation that had built its power on spirit and sacrifice, there was no defense against a machine that didn't feel hate or fear. The few surviving Japanese aces understood it too well. One pilot, after being shot down and rescued at sea, told his interrogators, "The Americans don't fight us. They erase us." Back at the airfields, younger pilots prayed before takeoff, bowing to the sun, touching the wings of their planes as if they were shrines. The older ones no longer prayed. They just looked at the horizon and sighed. They had seen too much to believe in miracles. American radio chatter filled the airwaves with laughter and confidence. Pilots joked mid-flight, shared stories, even whistled as they flew. Their war was efficient, predictable, survivable. The Japanese war was the opposite, lonely, desperate, and fading. Every day, more of Japan's infrastructure disappeared. Railways, oil depots, shipyards all turned to ash. And still, the Mustangs flew overhead, patrolling skies already conquered. One American general described it simply: when the P-51 arrived, the war shortened itself. On the ground, morale collapsed completely. Even the most loyal citizens began to see the truth. The empire was dying, not because its soldiers lacked courage, but because its enemies had mastered something greater. The illusion of invincibility that had defined Japan's war machine evaporated. The emperor's words, once sacred, now sounded distant and hollow against the roar of jet fuel and machine guns. Each Mustang sortie wrote another line in that reality. By mid-1945, Japan's air defenses were effectively gone. Entire squadrons existed only on paper. The surviving aircraft were hidden in caves, protected more by secrecy than strategy. The P-51s didn't even need to fight anymore. They just flew in circles, marking targets for bombers, watching the land burn below. To the Americans, it felt like inevitability. To the Japanese, it felt like watching the sun set on their nation. And yet, even in defeat, some pilots found strange moments of clarity. One veteran later said, "When I saw the Mustang up close, I realized it wasn't just a plane, it was the future. We were flying in the past." The P-51 symbolized everything that Japan had refused to believe in: collaboration, technology sharing, and industrial unity. It had British design, American engineering, and mass production precision. It wasn't a symbol of one nation. It was the product of many minds working toward one goal. And that's why it won. Japan's isolation, once its strength, had become its cage. In the Pacific sky, the last remnants of resistance faded. A few pilots still took off, some seeking revenge, others redemption. Most didn't return. The sky had turned from battlefield to grave. The Americans, meanwhile, began preparing for something even greater: the final invasion of Japan itself. The Mustangs would lead the way, clearing the skies before the troops landed. But fate intervened first. A new weapon appeared on the horizon, something that made even the P-51 seem small by comparison. When the atomic bomb fell on Hiroshima, the Mustangs were already there, circling above the smoke, watching history change beneath them. And just like that, the war that began with dogfights ended with silence. For the men who had flown the Mustang, it felt like victory. For the Japanese who had faced it, it felt like the end of the world. The P-51 had done what no weapon before it could. It made courage irrelevant, and in doing so, it changed the meaning of war forever. When Japan finally surrendered in August 1945, the world exhaled, but in the silence that followed, the echo of engines still haunted the skies. The P-51 Mustang had become more than just an aircraft. It was a symbol of an entire age ending. For Japan's airmen, it represented the moment they realized the world had changed forever, that no amount of faith or sacrifice could turn back what technology had unleashed. Across the burned landscapes of the Pacific, twisted wrecks of Zeros lay scattered on beaches, in jungles, in rice fields. Once proud machines of the Emperor, now silent monuments to a vanished belief that the will of one nation could overcome the machinery of another. When the Allied occupation began, American pilots visited the airfields they had once bombed. They walked among the remnants of Japan's aerial pride, touching the fuselages of broken Zeros, running fingers over bullet holes and faded symbols of the rising sun. Some were amazed at how light the planes felt, fragile, almost delicate. Others felt something else: respect. Even in defeat, the Japanese pilots had fought with unmatched skill and courage. What they lacked was not bravery, but time. The world had simply moved faster than they could keep up. The Mustang was the manifestation of that speed, a machine born from innovation, collaboration, and relentless improvement. Its pilots weren't demigods or samurai. They were young men guided by training, teamwork, and technology. And in that difference lay the truth of modern war. At its peak, the P-51 could fly over 1,600 kilometers without refueling, escort bombers across oceans, and still fight toe-to-toe with anything the enemy had. It wasn't just a fighter, it was a statement. The industrial world had arrived. For Japan, that realization was devastating. In the months after the surrender, American intelligence officers interviewed captured pilots. Many spoke quietly, their voices steady, their eyes tired. One said, "We never hated your pilots. We feared your factories." Another added, "Your planes were not built by warriors. They were built by nations." That distinction became one of the defining lessons of World War II. The age of the individual hero, the lone ace who could turn the tide, was over. The future belonged to those who could outthink, outbuild, and outlast. And the Mustang was proof. It had been designed through an alliance. British engineers provided the engine, American factories perfected mass production, and thousands of workers, many of them women, built it piece by piece. It was the ultimate expression of unity and purpose. When those silver wings appeared over the Pacific, they carried more than weapons. They carried the combined strength of democracy, industry, and science. For Japan, it was an impossible equation. No matter how brave their pilots were, no matter how skilled their engineers, they couldn't match an enemy that turned every citizen, every factory, every idea into part of the same machine. That was the real power behind the P-51. In post-war Japan, many of the surviving airmen struggled to find meaning in peace. The military code that had guided their lives was gone. The emperor had spoken not as a god, but as a man. The myths that had fueled their courage had turned to dust. And yet, in the ruins, a new kind of strength began to grow. Those same pilots who once worshipped the Zero began studying engineering, aerodynamics, and design. Some joined the new industrial rebirth of Japan. They had seen firsthand the price of falling behind, and now they vowed never to let it happen again. Within a generation, the same nation that had once relied on spirit over science became one of the most technologically advanced in the world. That transformation was the quiet legacy of defeat, a legacy born in part from the sound of those Mustangs overhead. Even among American pilots, the war left complicated feelings. They had won decisively, but they knew what it meant. They had seen the faces of men who fought with honor but without hope. Victory in its purest form never feels like glory. It feels like survival. For those who flew the P-51, there was pride, yes, but also awe. They had witnessed the moment when humanity crossed a line, the point where machines became the real warriors. Years later, one Mustang pilot summed it up perfectly. We didn't just defeat Japan, we defeated the past. The Mustang's roar eventually faded from the Pacific. New wars would come, new jets, new technologies, but the lessons of that sky remained. Technology had triumphed, but it had also warned. Because in that victory lay a paradox. The more advanced our machines become, the easier it is to forget the human cost behind them. The P-51 was beautiful, yes, but it was beautiful in the same way a storm is beautiful, powerful, inevitable, unstoppable. For the Japanese pilots who saw it up close, that beauty was terrifying. To them, it was the sound of the end. But in that end, the world began again. The skies they once ruled became symbols of peace, and the factories that once built weapons would soon build cars, cameras, and radios. The same minds that engineered war would now engineer progress. It's strange to think that out of so much destruction came so much renewal. But maybe that's what history always does. It destroys to rebuild, humbles to teach, silences to remind us what truly matters. When people today see a restored P-51 flying at an air show, gleaming under the sun, it's easy to admire its beauty without remembering what it meant. It's more than a plane. It's a memory of how quickly humanity can evolve and how close we can come to forgetting why we fight at all. The Mustang didn't just end Japan's air dominance, it ended the idea that bravery alone could win a modern war. And yet within that truth there's a certain poetry, because even as courage was defeated in the sky, it survived in the hearts of those who dared to fly anyway. They flew knowing the odds. They flew knowing they would lose. And still, they flew. That perhaps is the real victory of the human spirit, not in triumph, but in persistence. As the last of Japan's wartime pilots faded into history, many spoke of one haunting memory. The shimmer of silver wings passing overhead, sunlight glinting off metal that seemed untouchable. Some said it was the sound of death. Others said it was the sound of the future. Maybe it was both, because the P-51 Mustang wasn't a T, just the end of an era. It was the beginning of the world we live in now.